Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Franklin Smith, and I'm a partner at the Simon Phoenix Group. And welcome to this morning's webinar presentation on the CRA tuition donation tax calculation. If everything is working fine, you should see my video on your screen right now. My goal today is a number of things. First of all, I'm going to begin the formal presentation in a moment. I just wanted to simply give you the opportunity to see who is speaking today. The old adage, a picture's worth 1,000 words. But I will be stopping my video just before I go into my presentation, just to make sure the focus is on the presentation and not on the video image. So with that in mind, good morning, and I hope everyone gets something out of the video presentation or the webinar presentation this morning. And by all means, we are available for questions that are going to be part of today's session, and we're certainly available after the webinar as well. You'll see our website on the presentation itself. So there's lots of ways to contact us. So let me start then by starting the presentation momentarily. And there we go. So welcome again. Let me first start by explaining a little bit about who the Simon Phoenix Group is and our relationship with the Ontario Federation of Independent Schools. We're thrilled to be exclusive sponsors of OFIS's webinar series, and this is the first in a series of webinars that OFIS is putting on this year. So we're very pleased with our association with OFIS, and we're thrilled to be a part of this program. So today's session is on CRA tuition donation tax calculation. The Simon Phoenix Group is a software licensing organization. We have a software product that we've developed that we're marketing, a product called Phoenix NP Complete. But the focus really today is more on the experience that our organization brings to the table. We are not only a software licensing firm, but we are also a consulting organization. We have over 25 plus years of professional software development experience, but we also understand the education business. I myself worked at the executive director level of some faith-based schools in the Greater Toronto area for the better part of 7 or 8 years. Prior to that, I was an independent consultant heavily involved in the Toronto District School Board's amalgamation process of the late 90s and early 2000s. So we understand the education business, and our product has been developed with that market and the nonprofit market in mind. So let me then formally begin, and we're here today to talk about the CRA tuition donation tax calculation. And this calculation has as its ultimate basis a document that was put out by the Canada Revenue Agency back in 1975 called IC 7523. And there are a number of things that you need to know about IC 7523. It is the basis for this tuition donation calculation. Faith-based schools, faith-based independent schools in Canada, who are also registered charitable organizations, are able to issue donation receipts for a certain portion of tuition fees paid. And the purpose of today's webinar is to explain a little bit about that process and to provide hopefully some practical examples. Given that it was written in 1975, it's a fairly old document. It is relied upon by CRA when they conduct audits, and organizations, registered charitable organizations, are expected to adhere to CRA's guidelines and policies around this. So this is a document that's well worth reviewing from time to time and having as well in your hip pocket, so you know what it is that's expected. IC 7523 is definitely open to interpretation. There is lots of room for interpretation, and that, more than anything else, is where organizations can potentially get themselves into difficulties with CRA. And I'm assuming that by virtue of the large group that we have today, this is something that everyone wants to avoid. And IC 7523 is essentially becomes a means that the federal government provides partial tax offset to tuition payors for unused educational tax payments. As members of Canadian society, clearly we have federal, provincial, and local taxes to pay. Part of our local taxes is an education component, and just because families choose to send their children to a faith-based school doesn't excuse them from paying this portion of taxes. So essentially, whether the federal government intends it or not, essentially being able to provide a donation receipt for a portion of tuition fees paid to faith-based independent schools effectively becomes a tax payment offset. IC 7523 is not legislation, and that is something very important to keep in mind. It is an information circular only. It is not unambiguous, and this relates back to my previous comment about how it's open to interpretation. It is not always understood well, and that goes for anyone. That goes out in the general population. That could be CRA auditors themselves. There may be CRA auditors who are not up on IC 7523. I don't have personally. I have run this calculation myself using spreadsheets for 6, 7, 8 years. I've never run across a situation where an auditor didn't understand it, but I have been told by some people who have been involved in audits that an initial auditor who was sent to them did not understand IC 7523. So that certainly is possible. Sorry, I'm just going to go back one step. So I have a couple of links here. The first link, this is going directly to CRA's website, and this is what I've been talking about, IC 7523. The date on it is September 29th, 1975, and I'm just going to go scroll through it quickly. There's basically 9, 10, 12 points. It's not an overly lengthy document, so that's something that you should certainly be familiar with, and this is right up on CRA's website. It's fairly easy to find. All you need to do is type in IC 7523 in their search box, and it will come up. So that's the actual document. The key thing with IC 7523 is schools need to perform a calculation that determines the net secular cost of providing education. And that, in essence, is what IC 7523 is all about. How one goes about performing that calculation is where the interpretation is where the effort comes in. But at its core, what a school is trying to do is to determine what its religious costs are, what its secular costs are, and therefore being able to determine what the net secular cost per student is, and the government allows you then to receipt as a donation for amounts paid in excess of that net secular cost per student. So, and that's what essentially paragraphs 7, 8, and 9 here on IC 7523 talk about. There is another document, an information letter that goes along with IC 7523, and there it is. And again, you can see it's directly off of CRA's website, where they go into a little bit more detail on some of the definitions, what a gift is. They specifically define, for the purposes of the circular, what a parent means. And you can see here, a parent is essentially anyone who is paying tuition on behalf of a specific child. So that's where the definition is. So parent is very loosely defined by them. The crux of the calculation really comes down to one key factor: whether a school is able to show that it can segregate its secular and religious costs. And we're going to talk about that. A school that can do that, and probably most schools should be able to do that, and this will come out as we go through the presentation, are in a favorable position, because then they can receipt for tuitions paid in excess of the secular component only. And that's essentially what this information letter is referring to. So so that's where we essentially are on this slide, and these two documents are something that clearly you, as a faith-based independent school, need to be familiar with. So let's get into the various components of the calculation. There are a number of things that factor in to performing the calculation, and the first piece of this is understanding your own program, understanding where your secular education and religious education components are, and how much of your overall curriculum, educational business is devoted to secular versus religious. You also need to know and have a good handle on your student population year over year. And this is also going to come up numerous times through this discussion, is that in essence, most schools, I'm sure, receive tuition payments over the course of a year. Of course, we're dealing with a couple of different years here. We're dealing with an academic year, which generally goes from September through June, with July and August off. And we have the concept of a calendar or tax year, which goes from January to December. So in any given tax or calendar year, you are going to have two components. Two academic years, essentially bridging that single tax year. So that's something that you need to be aware of, and you need to have the student population data as well as other data to be able to deal with that. Clearly, school expenditures. We're talking about trying to calculate a net secular cost, so clearly schools need to have a very good handle on their expense base. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. It's not much of a limb. I'm sure you'll realize in a moment that was more tongue-in-cheek, but I'm sure, without exaggerating, pretty much every school who's in attendance today can probably state with some confidence that approximately 75% of their expense base is salary and benefit related. That is always, and certainly in our experience, the single largest and majority component of any school. And it makes most sense. People are expensive, and getting quality people costs money. So when trying to ensure that your expenses are properly segregated between secular and religious, that would then mean that you need to be able to show, if in the case of an audit, that you have a good handle and good segregation of your costs, certainly on the payroll and salary side. Non-parent income. There is a portion of the calculation that allows schools to subtract from their expense base non-parent income received. So that would be donations from non-parents, that would be grants from other organizations. Those donations received essentially become a reduction of the of the gross secular costs. So what that means is that the Canada Revenue Agency is really putting it back on schools, faith-based schools that are registered charitable organizations, to go beyond their immediate parent community to seek out donations in order to be able to better fund their programs. And, of course, the last component in all this, and one of the more important components, you need to know which students have paid, or you need to know, sorry, the students generally don't pay tuitions. You need to know which tuition payments have been made by whom on behalf of what students and when. So you can see the larger the school, the greater the emphasis is going to be on managing your data and managing it well. And so when you put all that together, ta-da, that gives you the answer. Now, clearly that's not the end of the presentation. We're going to move beyond there and drill into each of the components. So on the secular and religious curriculum side of things, which is the first component that I spoke to, you need to be able to come up with a method of determining what your split between secular and religious is. And this will be different for different schools. There is no one answer that fits for every school. You need to understand what you're going to be basing that split on. Is it just pure conjecture? Hopefully not. Is it going to be based on where the students are spending their time in the day? Is it going to be based on your curriculum? Is it going to be based on having your costs between religious and secular allocated out on a account-by-account basis? How are you going to do it? I would probably hazard a guess that most schools it's going to be a mixture. And again, it's particular to each school, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail as well as we go through the presentation. How are you going to be splitting it? Is it going to be an entire school average, or is it going to be specific to each grade? In other words, is the religious component of the education that you're delivering significantly different from grade to grade that would make it unreasonable to average things out over all grades of your school? And again, that's very particular to each school. I think one of the things I've been trying to get across this morning is making sure that you clearly define what constitutes secular, what constitutes religious. And it's interesting that that information letter that I showed you a few moments ago does actually speak to this a little bit, and it gives a broad definition, and you can read it there. It's in one of the opening paragraphs. And it then goes on to say that CRA definitely does not consider the teaching of mathematics and history and things like that as being religious, unless, of course, they are focused specifically on religious history or religious prayer sessions, things of that nature. Those are considered religious. And CRA, interestingly enough, we have a number of schools, a number of Jewish day schools represented today in today's session. Interestingly enough, CRA does specify as well that the teaching of Hebrew as a language itself, in and of itself, does constitute religious programming. So that's an interesting thing to note. No other non-English language is specified in that way. The bottom line with all of this, when you're dealing with CRA, is it reasonable, and is it defendable? Now, I've put together just a very quick spreadsheet just to show you how one could approach splitting out your religious versus secular components. And this is just a very straightforward looking at the schedule by groups of grades and identifying specifically hours and activities that directly relate to religious programming, with a total and with calculation of percentages. And that's done on a grade-by-grade basis. You can see there are grade-specific allocations here. Usually this is something that a principal or someone in administration would sign off on, but that's just a very simple example of how one might approach the allocation process. As I said, another way of approaching it is based on looking at your expenses, and again being able to allocate out on a teacher-by-teacher basis components of salaries that directly relate to religious and those that directly relate to secular education, and then simply being able to total up your expenses on a school year by school year basis, split between religious and secular, and doing your allocations that way. So that's essentially where we're at on the secular and religious side of things. Moving on then, student population data. Again, grade-specific splits. Those are important, and those are important to know specifically if you're looking at calculating your percentage splits on a grade-by-grade basis. So you need to know which students are in which grades. It may sound like a fairly, or it may sound obvious, but it's important to have a handle on the data. You need to think about how to deal with non-full year enrollments. You're trying to determine a net secular cost for all students, or on a student-by-student basis, net secular cost per student for a full calendar year, which is going to be a blend between two academic years. So that means, therefore, that if you have students who are present in one academic year and not another, or students who are enrolled late during the year or who withdraw early, it therefore means that their net secular cost needs to be allocated based on the amount of time that they were actually present in your program during those years. So that's something to consider. Clearly, this data needs to be tracked year over year. Does one deal with actual student counts or deal with full-time equivalent students? And this goes back to how to deal with non-full year enrollments. And we'll get into an example in a moment. And again, is it reasonable and is it defendable? So when we look at a calculation on this, you can see that for this school, there's a grade-by-grade student population count for the 2010-11 school years and the 2011-2012 school years. There's also an option here to be able to take into consideration programs that may not be full-time. A lot of JK programs are not full-time. And so you can certainly total up your student population for this year and that year and come up with a simple average, but the simple average doesn't take into consideration the fact that you had a program that may not be a full-time program, and doesn't take into consideration the fact that you have one part of the year which constitutes 6/10 of a calendar year and the other academic year which constitutes 4/10 of the calendar year. So perhaps a weighted average is a better way to go, and here's a way to perform that weighted average calculation based on these allocations, you come up with these adjusted numbers, 6/10, 4/10, and do your weighting, and you can come up with a weighted average student population for that tax year. And that's a fairly straightforward way of performing that calculation. So that's the student population side of things. On the school expense base, this goes back to some of the things that I was saying earlier. So I'm going to probably go through this a little bit quicker, how to deal with two separate school years. Most schools are probably using one of QuickBooks or Simply Accounting or some other readily available financial accounting package. It's important to have that set up properly. It's important to have your expenses allocated to the proper fiscal year. It's important to have your expenses allocated as best as possible between religious and secular. And again, this goes back to each individual school. Some schools will have programs where they have their religious teachers and they have their secular teachers, and the two don't meet and the two don't teach each other's programs, and that's great. That should make it easy. You know, teachers 1, 2, 3 teach religion. Teachers 4, 5, 6 teach on the secular side. You can easily map that. You can easily segregate those costs. The trick comes in when you're dealing with things that are not as easily segregated, such as overhead costs. Your school's operating in a single building. You don't have partitions where you have rooms that are solely dedicated to the teaching of religion and rooms that are dedicated to teaching secular studies, nor can you segregate utilities and administrative costs and things like that. The good news is that if you go through the information letter and IC 7523, you will see that CRA does give provision for allocating those types of overhead costs that are not very easily segregated. And the manner that you can do that is, again, goes back to making sure that you have the data to back up whatever assumptions you're making. So if you're going to be allocating those costs based on the fact that during the course of a year or 2 years, your religious studies component accounted for 60% of your curriculum and your secular studies accounted for 40% of your curriculum, if that's the way you want to allocate it, that may be a reasonable way to do it. So again, this is very specific to each school. We've been talking about how to segregate costs. When it comes to payroll, if your school operates on more of an integrated basis where every teacher teaches components of both the religious and secular side, you're going to need to allocate those expenses in your financial records on some basis, so that if CRA does come in and audits, they can see that on a payroll by payroll basis, your individual teacher salaries have been allocated properly between the religious and secular sides. Now, it stands to reason that a school that teaches or whose religious and secular split, maybe let's say 60-40, 60% on the religious side, 40% on the secular side, it stands to reason that probably their payroll costs will mirror that. That's probably a reasonably good assumption. However, in order to meet CRA's litmus test, and in order to be able to be seen by them to be operating within the guidelines of IC 7523, it is important to segregate your costs as much as possible. Are there any expenditures not to be included? The CRA specifically notes that operating costs are to be included, but capital costs are not to be included, and that would include debt payment on loans, for instance, for capital purposes, capital improvement purposes. Capital costs are not included. Operating costs are included. And again, is it reasonable and is it defendable? And so just very briefly, I don't want this to become a lesson in QuickBooks, but your expense base, you should be able to generate some report, and this is just a very simple report out of QuickBooks or out of Simply Accounting or whichever financial accounting package you're using that would give you the breakdown category by category, and in addition to this would also provide your religious and secular splits directly from your financial accounting package. And that's essentially what that should look like, and that's what you should be generating out of that. Non-parent income. Again, where does the data come from? You need to be able to know in a given calendar year who has made donations, who has provided you with non-tuition income, and that could be from non-parent sources, extended family, grants from other nonprofits or private foundations, what have you. There are multiple sources. The key thing here, though, to note is that any donations received from non-parent sources cannot be directed towards the education of a particular student in order for it to be deemed to be a donation. If it's directed towards a single student, then it's a tuition payment. It's not a donation. So that's something to be very, very careful of. How to deal with companies owned or controlled by parents, or limited corporations, limited liability organizations are legally separate entities, and just because they may be controlled by a parent, any donations coming from those organizations should be viewed by CRA as being non-parent income. And I use the word should. That is direct advice that over the years I have been given, that has been confirmed from CRA. But of course, you know, with any large governmental organization, you ask the same question to two different people on two different days, you could potentially get two different answers. So with everything that I'm saying today, please do make sure that before you do anything or make any changes to your program or to the way in which you conduct this calculation, you do get audit and or legal advice as necessary. I don't purport to be an auditor. I don't purport to be an attorney or a lawyer. So yes, advice of those professionals is always warranted when necessary. Grants, miscellaneous income, non-parent donation income. As I said, when CRA does allow you to subtract that income from your gross secular costs in order to be able to generate a net secular cost figure. Are any non-parent donation amounts not eligible for inclusion? And just as on the expense side where you can't include expenses that are capital, you also cannot include donation amounts that are directed towards capital programs. So those cannot be included. Again, is it reasonable? Is it defendable? And again, a very simple spreadsheet to illustrate how this might be laid out. And again, there you go, being able to pull this data from some source at your organization, whether it's your financial accounting records or some other application that you have running that tracks donations, to be able to pull that information out quickly. Particularly if you have a CRA auditor sitting there watching you pull that data, or expecting to see you be able to pull that data quickly. So student tuition payments. Again, where does the data come from? Hopefully you have all this in your financial accounting records and can get at that quickly. And you should obviously be able to know for a particular student each tuition transaction, who paid the tuition, what date the tuition was paid, and the amount, of course. Tuition payments by extended family members. This is another one of those complicating factors in the calculation. If you have multiple tuition payors for a single student, then of course the net secular cost for that student really should be allocated between those payors. It wouldn't be reasonable to give the full net secular cost or deduct the full net secular cost from one tuition payor and then receipts the full amount to the other tuition payor. So there needs to be an allocation process there, and your data needs to be up for the challenge, or your application that you're using needs to be up for the challenge. What about tuition payments by parent-owned companies? There are specific guidelines with respect to that, and there's specific documentation that CRA wants to see, especially if a company is making a tuition payment, but a request comes through to issue the receipt in the name of a parent. The parent being the parent controlling the corporation. It can be done, but there is specific documentation that that is required, and again, that's something that your auditor should be asked if you're in that kind of situation. What about tuition payments made by securities transfer? This is something that's relatively recent, where CRA does allow the donation of securities to be transferred from the donor to the recipient school, and those transfers need to be receipted at 100%. So if those transfers are being used to pay for tuition, you could potentially run into an issue where you receipt upon transfer of securities at 100%, and you could potentially run into a problem if you allow up to 100% payment, because then when you go to perform the CRA tax calculation, you'll be generating additional receipts in value beyond 100% of the tuition paid. So you need to be very careful about how to handle that. And again, is it reasonable? Is it defendable? And again, what you should be able to generate out of your financial accounting package is essentially a list that looks like that. Students, parents, or payors, payment amount, payment dates. And depending on the size of the school, the list could be shorter or the list could be longer. And being able to handle all that data, if it is a long list, becomes part of the art of managing this. So, in order to bring it all together, what are some of the things that you need to watch out for? You need to be able to properly deal with multiple tuition payors for the same student and allocate the net secular cost accordingly. You need to be able to deal with students who are not in attendance for the full portions of both academic years, and again, be able to allocate the net secular cost accordingly. You need to be able to, as I noted, deal with the securities transfer issue, and there are some schools out there that simply don't allow payment of tuition by securities transfer at all. Some schools that allow it up to a certain percentage, so that they know that they're not going to run into the problem of being in the position of over-receipting for tuition payments. And then calculating the net secular cost per student. That's really where we're where we're at now. So there are any number of ways to do this, and depending on your school and your specific program, you need to be able to bring in your allocations, which I've shown you, your student population, your expense base, your non-parent income, and you then can start thinking about calculating your net secular cost per student. Depending on your school and how you want to approach it and your program, you can decide that our religious component is pretty much equivalent from grade to grade. It's really not that much different, so we're really creating a lot of extra work for ourselves and not generating any benefit by looking at it on a grade-by-grade basis, or you could have a significantly different program. I'm showing you both methods here just because. And so based on your ability to be able to allocate your costs out, you would then come up with a gross secular cost. And again, I've already spoken about the different ways of properly allocating out your secular and religious costs. Deducting from that your non-parent income received to generate a net secular cost, looking at your student population, in this case the weighted average student population, and then coming up with a net secular cost per full-time student. It complicates the calculation quite a bit to do it on a grade-by-grade basis, but if that is reasonable and defendable for your school, then by all means, that's something that could be done, but it needs to be done. It needs to be done carefully. And so the bottom line with all this is whichever method you're using, you want to be able to come up with a net secular cost per full-time student to then be able to say, for any given student, here's their tuition that was paid during the full year, here's the proportion of each academic year that they were enrolled in your school, and this particular student happens to be enrolled there for the full year, and therefore you generate your net secular cost. You know what your total tuition payments are, and therefore you can generate a amount that can be receipted. I'm cognizant of the time. It's coming up to 10:42. I don't want to encroach too much on the Q&A portion. I do have a few more slides to go through. Clearly, this is a big topic, and we're not going to be able to get it all done in an hour. But I do want to at least give everyone in attendance today a reasonably good overview of what needs to be taken into consideration. And again, depending on the size of your school, the calculation could be significant, or it could be less significant depending on the number of students. The things that you need to keep in mind, of course, are, as I mentioned, students that are not enrolled for both portions of each academic year, and therefore their net secular cost per student needs to be proportionally reduced. And in this spreadsheet model, I'm showing that being done. So, moving on, performing the calculation, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. 3 basic methods. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Clearly, paper, pencil, and calculator I don't think is something that people want to be involved in unless you happen to be running a very small school where this may be the most reasonable solution. But I would say the vast majority of people would probably be using the spreadsheet method of performing the calculation. There are a lot of pros to this. The tools are readily available. Calculations can easily be subdivided amongst staff members and then can be brought together fairly easily. It's definitely faster processing time than manually, and you're reducing the error of mathematical errors. some of the disadvantages or cons is that it does require spreadsheet programming knowledge, and for those of you who can do it, great. It's probably a very good tool. There is time required to develop and maintain the model, and depending on how sophisticated your spreadsheet model is, it may require you still to perform manual data manipulations. Computer applications, everything's becoming computerized these days, and costs are dropping. Significant number of advantages, fairly simple numerical inputs, no knowledge of computer programming or spreadsheets. Spreadsheet programming is necessary. Rapid calculations allows for data checks. And again, like with spreadsheets, you're reducing the mathematical error factor. Disadvantage, of course, is that computer applications aren't necessarily free. The good news is that there is a computer application out there, and I'm sure it's not going to come as a surprise to you to know that our application, as far as we're aware, is the only application that does allow a school to perform the calculation independently on their own from start to finish. And I'm going to take an extra couple of minutes. I see it's 10:44 right now, 10:45. I'm going to take a couple of extra minutes just to very briefly show you how our application works on the charitable receiving side of things. So a school would be presented with, or a user would be presented with this screen with the option for the inputs that I've spoken about. There are expense-based inputs here, and again, it's entirely up to the school to determine how it comes up with, how it quantifies its expenses, how it segregates its secular versus religious costs, and how it comes up with these secular and religious splits. But it does allow you to enter that data, to have that inputted on a grade-by-grade basis, and it does, the system, because this application is an application that also has a student module to it, then it can pull from within the database your full-time equivalent student number. It performs that calculation automatically. Because our application also has a fundraising and donation tax receiving component to it, it can determine what the total non-parent income is. So with the proper inputs and making use of data already present in the application, it makes the calculation very straightforward. Simply refreshing the application and telling it to calculate the changes then allows you to preview your data, and there's already revenue data that has been input into the system, and there you go. Push of a button, it performs the calculation. I'm pleased to say that our application has been tested with schools that have run their calculation by spreadsheet, and the numbers come up consistently correct. So this application has received testing. It is being used by our customers, and our customers are very pleased by its speed and how it has been able to lighten the burden of performing this calculation significantly. There have also been opportunities for us to review the calculation in more detail with schools, and time again, any questions that have come up have always been questions specific to how our calculation how our calculation performs has always been verified and has always been shown to be accurate. So there is that track record. We do support multiple calculations, either average or on a grade-specific side, and there's multiple multiple years and different data that the application shows, all geared around determining what that net secular cost per student is. And there are some schools out there who receive their tuition payments for an academic year all within a single tax year. So, for instance, there may be schools out there that for the current 2011-2012 school year receive all of your tuition payments for this year by December of this year, in which case the calculation is quite simplified. There is no need to bridge separate years, and so we allow for that calculation as well. So at this point, I am going to, bear with me, sorry, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I see that there have been a significant number of questions asked, so bear with me for a moment as I go through them and just provide you with some answers. Let's see. One of the first questions here regarding the allocations of salaries. Yes, can salary of the teacher be divided among the students, and receipts of their share be given as a charitable donation? Yes, the answer to that question is certainly yes. The ultimate answer to that question really, as I said, comes down to being able to accurately allocate your expenses, and again, because the vast majority of a school's expense base is teacher focused, then being able to allocate your teacher expenses within your financial accounting records becomes critically important. And that's then something that needs to be very, very well thought through before running the calculation. So there were a few questions about the slides for today's presentation. Yes, the slides will be available. They'll be posted up on our website as well. I believe I noted for those who logged into the presentation just prior to 10 a.m., there was a notes slide up that indicated that a recording of this webinar is also being made, and that also will be posted up on our website. And you'll receive email notification of when that's available for viewing. Another question was related to revenue data. A particular school who manages all of their tuition payments in QuickBooks or Simply Accounting. We don't expect any of our clients with our application to have to perform double data entry. Most schools, we recognize, when managing their business office and their financial accounting records, particularly as it relates to tuition payments, because that in essence is a contractual relationship between you and your parents. You will want to manage those within your financial accounting software package to be able to properly manage the accounts receivable side of your business. So the nice thing about our application is that there is, in fact, the ability in our revenue module to be able to import data via spreadsheet upload, and it's simply with a few clicks of a mouse allows a school to be able to select a spreadsheet file I happen to have one here. It's all ready, and the system will think for a second, and voila. There were over 2,000 records in that spreadsheet that I just connected to, and they're all presented there. Now, for the purposes of my demonstration, I already had revenue data in there, but I can show you that uploading that into the system is as easy as selecting everyone and pressing the upload button over 2,000 records, select yes, and that's it. They've been uploaded. So it makes the process of getting your data into our system pretty straightforward and doesn't require any rekeying on your part. So we have another question from another school. There are some schools that provide bursaries or financial assistance. You may call it a subsidy, you may call it a bursary, you may call it whatever, for students that may not be able to afford the full fee. Our application does provide in our student module, does allow for schools to enter any discounts or subsidies or any revenue reduction, but ultimately when you're performing the calculation, you're performing the calculation based on tuition actually paid, not the tuition that is charged. So by making sure that therefore that your accounts receivable data or your transactional tuition payment data is accurate, we'll automatically deal with that because you're going to be then basing the calculation based on what was actually paid, not was actually charged, or not necessarily what the full fee was. So hopefully that addresses that question. We have time for a few more questions. So we had a couple of questions on the cost of our product. We would invite anyone who is interested in the product to contact us directly. And I'm not trying to evade or avoid the question. I'm happy to give you a price. It's we have our base price for our application. It's a licensed product. It's a monthly subscription fee, and that fee is dependent on whether a school is an OFIS member or not. We have a full fee and we have an OFIS member discounted fee based upon our existing relationship with OFIS. So if anyone is interested in more details, then by all means, our full fee is $200 a month. That includes all updates. That includes 5 hours of support on a monthly basis. There is a one-time only install training data upload charge of $1,000, but it's a fairly simple pricing model, and it is not dependent on number of users or number of students or number of donor records or anything like that. Let's see, another question then relates to emailing of tax receipts. Yes, CRA does allow tax receipts to be emailed rather than printed and mailed out, and our application definitely supports that. The trick with emailing receipts is that if you go into the Charities Directorate portion of CRA's website, they will state very clearly that receipts need to be sent in such a way that they are, for lack of a better word, they're locked down. In other words, a person receiving that receipt cannot make any editing changes to it. The best product or the most used product out there that would do that would be the Adobe Acrobat 8.0 or higher. That allows you to create PDFs that you can then lock down, essentially allowing the recipient to only open it and print it. And that will satisfy CRA's requirement to make sure that no fraudulent activity can take place. And our application does support the emailing of receipts, which then means that you're going to be saving yourself on mailing costs and saving yourself on staff time for stuffing envelopes and paper costs. Another question that was asked, and I'm trying to do this as best as possible in order in which they were asked to give priority, and we have 1 minute left to go. So it looks like this is the last question that we can handle. A few people have asked, well, I'll try and deal with two. A few people have asked about spreadsheet examples being available on our website. We're not going to be making those spreadsheet examples available off our website for the simple reason that they've been developed for demonstration purposes only. And I don't want to put them up on our website because, as I've mentioned before, this calculation, the way you perform the calculation is going to be very school specific. And so I would not want anyone to download those spreadsheets and try and then use them for their own school situation, because the assumptions built into how those spreadsheets were built may not be applicable. What I may very well do is take a few PDF snapshots of those spreadsheets as an example and just include them with the PowerPoint slides. So that hopefully will assist there. And it's 11 o'clock, so I am going to suggest that we wrap up now. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. So by all means, if anyone has any questions, I'm going to leave this this slide up on the screen. Our website is in the lower right-hand corner, www.simonphoenixgroup.ca. As I said, you will all get an automated email in approximately an hour's time thanking you for taking part, and we have all your email addresses, so when the slides and video are up on our website, you will also receive email notification of that. Our contact telephone numbers are on our website. Our email address is there, but and you'll, as I said, you'll be getting an automated email that has my email address, but I'm Franklin, F-R-A-N-K-L-I-N, as you can see, and that's my email address, franklin@simonphoenixgroup.ca. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone who commented on what a great presentation it was. I appreciate the positive feedback, and if you have other feedback as well, I'm happy to receive it. So I will wish everyone a fabulous day. Thank you very much, and take care.